Good evening and welcome. I'm Simon Hicks. I'm head of the Government Department here at the LSE. Welcome to the inaugural lecture of our new Graham Wallas Chair, Professor Anne Phillips. I'm going to say a few words about the Graham Wallas Chair before introducing Anne. When Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, Graham Wallace and George Bernard Shaw established the LSE in 1895, the intention was that Wallace would become the first director of the school. After he declined, he did agree to teach at the school and eventually became the first professor of political science at the LSE, a post which he held from 1914 to 1923. Wallace was an empirical social scientist who sought to use evidence and examples to contribute to our theoretical understanding of political psychology in particular. His most famous works were his books Human Nature and Politics, 1908, The Great Society, 1914, Our Social Heritage, 1921, and The Art of Thought, 1926. Graham Wallas was succeeded to the chair by Harold Lasky, Michael Oakeshott, Maurice Cranston, Brian Barry, David Held, and now Anne Phillips. Anne joined the LSE in 1999 as Professor of Gender Theory and Director of the LSE Gender Institute, and later moved to a joint appointment between the Gender Institute and the Department of Government. Anne is one of the leading figures in feminist political theory and has written extensively on issues of body and property, democracy and representation, equality, multiculturalism, and difference. Anne has published over 100 books, articles, and essays, and her work has been translated into Spanish, German, French, I didn't know the latest version, French, Chinese, Turkish, Croatian, Slovenian, and a few others that I haven't mentioned, I'm sure. In 1992, she was co-winner of the American Political Science Association's Victoria Schuck Award for Best Book on Women and Politics for Engendering Democracy. She was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Aalborg in 1999, was elected Fellow of the British Academy in 2003, and also was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Bristol earlier last year. Just this year. In 2008, Anne received a special recognition award from the Political Studies Association of the UK for her contribution to political studies. In 2012, she was awarded the title Graham Wallas Professor of Political Science, and just this week she became an academician of the Academy of Social Sciences. Today, Anne will lecture on the human in politics, returning to the topic on which Graham Wallas began his career at the LSE. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I'm very honoured to be here, and very honoured to have been made the Graham Wallas Professor of Political Science. I never thought that I would end up as a Professor of Political Science, since I've spent much of my academic career complaining that politics is not something that is meant to be scientific. And of course, I'm especially honoured to be recognised in this way by the department and the school, when the area in which I've made my name, feminist political theory, remains very much a minority occupation, so it's particularly an honour. Just one slight apology, which is that, as you can probably tell from my rather husky voice, I have rather a bad sore throat, and I'm kind of reminded of an occasion when I was flown at what seemed to me enormous cost to Australia to give one of the plenary talks at a major conference there. And I arrived in Sydney and I had completely lost my voice. And I spent 4 days kind of in a total panic as to whether I would recover it in time. Fortunately I did. So anyway, so my title obviously is intended as a bow in the direction of Graham Wallas, who, as Simon said, published a book called Human Nature in Politics in 1908, which was still required reading for politics undergraduates when I was studying philosophy and politics at Bristol in the late 1960s. A picture of Graham Wallas. Now I realise, rereading it for tonight's lecture, that I really didn't at all get the message of the book, which is a kind of it's a kind of proleptic critique of rational choice, in fact. Wallace challenged what he called the intellectualist assumption, quote, that every human action is the result of an intellectual process by which a man first thinks of some end which he desires and then calculates the means by which that end can be attained. It was a mistake, in his view, to work with idealized notions of the rational, self-interested man, But it was also a mistake to work with notions of the average one. He was very insistent on variation, on the range and variability of human behaviours and characteristics. And here his argument better suits the preoccupations of my more scientific colleagues. He very much stressed the role of quantitative methods in capturing that variation and generating more accurate answers to political questions. Now, at the time that I read this, I don't think I took much more away from the book than just the idea that people had very different notions of human nature. And for what I like to think was just a short period, because it was clearly a very simplistic idea, I thought that you could make sense of pretty much everything in politics by the question of whether people had an optimistic or a pessimistic view of human nature. So this is a slide which you can look at, but you should immediately banish from your minds because it's wrong, right? Which was, so in my I had Hobbes clearly, Thomas Hobbes clearly as a pessimist, thinking human beings were all out to do one another down, needing an all-powerful state to keep them in check. John Locke, an optimist, human beings often in error, but basically full of good intentions and trying to do the right thing. Karl Marx, an optimist, and I've chosen the dashing young Marx rather than the bearded patriarch in order to sort of make that point. In Marx's view, once you free people from the relentless processes of capital accumulation, then they will work to the best of their abilities without either incentive or regulation. And Nietzsche, of course, a pessimist, sort of human beings driven by the will to power, but facing the terrifying prospect of eternal recurrence, the endless repetition in which everything repeats itself in the same form. Now, as I say, just erase that now from your mind, because though for a while this was a kind of handy way of dividing up the world and the problems of the world, fortunately for my progress towards the Graham Wallace chair, I realised that the story was more complex, and I didn't continue in this vein for long. I read Sheldon Wollin's Politics of Vision, which was particularly influential for me, which told a much more complex story. But more important still, I discovered the women's movement, which was full of people who were optimistic about the possibilities for radical change, but none of whom seemed to set much store by the notion of human nature. And in the famous words of Simone de Beauvoir, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Now, the processes that make us men and women don't just operate through the obvious everyday of encouraging little boys to be resilient and little girls to look sweet, but through the multiple and very perceptible ways in which we learn what is normal and what is not. Does that one come out all right? I'm thinking about these processes makes you doubt first whether there is anything particularly natural about the way we turn out to be, but also whether it makes any sense to talk about what humans essentially are before all that process of becoming men and women gets underway. Now, I think there was, and I think still is, a strand of thinking that conceives of liberation as a kind of freeing oneself from confinements and constraints and repressions and the requirement to act and speak and dress in particular kinds of ways. So a kind of thinks of liberation as a kind of throwing off of the shackles, as if at the end of this we can uncover the original untainted human being. We can get back to the real human nature before all this becoming women and men got underway. This understanding is, I think, very roughly what Michel Foucault described as the repressive hypothesis, and I think it's become less and less convincing. It seems to me that the only way you can plausibly think of there being a real and original us, existing prior to all the processes that make us comprehensible as human beings, would be if you operated with a very I mean, if you reduce the notion of the human to a sort of more or less physiological entity, that seems to me to be the only way that you could make sense of that. It's not, of course, that we can't change ourselves or that we can't challenge power relations, but the idea that we could throw off everything that makes us who we are to recapture some prior untainted self is, in my view, unintelligible. Now, I mean, I'm giving you here really what's just the bare bones of a critique of essentialism, which is clearly it's a critique not just of an essential feminine nature or an essential masculine nature, but is a critique of the idea of an essential human nature itself. Criticizing essentialism, however, can be somewhat paralyzing. And the worry that I start from in this lecture, and it's a worry that is particularly familiar in the feminist literature. The worry is that kind of critique of essentialism can make it impossible to articulate any sense of what we have in common. This is a worry that returns, I think, with particular force when thinking through some of the tensions between feminism and multiculturalism, which is something that I did quite a lot of work on over the last 10 years. And just very, very sort of briefly, there's a feminist critique of multiculturalism, which is essentially saying that the problem with multiculturalism is that it can empower cultural leaders who then mobilize ideas of what it is that's intrinsic to their culture, understood as they understand it, in ways that can justify abuses of women. But there's also something that I think a lot of feminists became very concerned about, which is the ways in which conservative critics of multiculturalism mobilize claims about equality or the rights of women in order to depict people from marginalized cultural groups as backward and profoundly other. So there's both of those kind of issues going on there. So, I mean, I'm thinking here of the kind of, the see how backward they are syndrome, kind of when people talk about how some sort of undefined they stone their women, they force their daughters into unwanted marriages, they deny girls an education, when the they in question is meant to refer to an entire nation or culture or religion. The differences in that kind of discourse are commonly framed as cultural or as religious, rather than, as would have been the case in an earlier epoch, in racial terms. But they retain strong racial undertones, and they can be deployed, as with more overtly racist discourses, to justify forms of treatment that would otherwise be considered inhuman. At their worst, those presumptions of difference can lead to some people being regarded and treated as less than human. Now, this is the worry that, many people have talked about, but Judith Butler, among others, draws attention to when she asks us to consider whose lives count as human lives, whose lives we regard as grievable, and points to the discrepancy between the indifference with which we glance over the figures of the dead and maimed in distant contexts, while grieving those closer to home, and the ease with which we construct images of the enemy or the barbarian that then relieve us of even minimal obligations of respect. But I think even in much lesser versions, just the more kind of everyday ways in which the casual assertions about the Irish or the Serbs or Muslims or Arabs, in those kind of casual assertions, there's an obliteration of both individuality and commonality in generalizations about entire peoples. So I'm thoroughly disenchanted with those exaggerations of difference that I think enter into a lot of the everyday talk about cultural difference and cultural others, and that come into play when people talk of what they conceive as cultural or national difference. And in that context, I increasingly want to invoke some strong notion of a common humanity, or the fundamental similarities in our shared condition, as a way of challenging this. So that, in a sense, is my starting point. But then, if you'll kind of follow me through the train of thought that's going on here, as I hope I'll be able to convey tonight, that language of a common humanity is problematic, right? So I want it, but I'm also kind of want to draw your attention to some of the difficulties with it in the process then of trying to reformulate it in ways that I think will better meet the challenge. The language of a common humanity is problematic. It's conceptually problematic, as I hope I'll indicate in some of the things that I'll say soon. It's also, I think, become less and less powerful as a way of mobilizing solidarity. In a recent analysis of what she calls post-humanitarianism, Lily Abbulu God, I'm glad to see is here tonight, writes of a shift in the way solidarity with distant others is framed in humanitarian appeals or the reporting of disasters and famine. Instead of what she describes as an other-oriented morality, framed broadly around notions of a common humanity, she argues that we're moving increasingly to what she terms a self-oriented morality, in which the giving always has to be associated with gratifications to the self. So whether it's the rock concert or the kind of the pleasure that we get in kind of, feeling ourselves in tune with, our favorite celebrity, or the kind of the gratification of kind of engaging ourselves in Twitter and so on. We are, she argues, all too knowing and too ironic to fall for the simplicities of that earlier notion of being linked in a common humanity. Now, it would be a mistake to exaggerate the impact of intellectuals in this, or indeed in anything. But I think this decline in the power of the notion of common humanity is partly because there's been so much criticism of notions of the human, human nature, or humanity in recent decades. For myself, working within a broadly feminist tradition, I've become very suspicious of definitions of our common humanity that revolve around notions like rationality or the capacity for purposive action. These are definitions that historically have constituted the man of reason as precisely that, a man. I've also, on the other side, come to suspect appeals to a stripped down, contentless humanity that we're all supposed to share. I don't accept that we have to set to one side the particularities of our gender, race, sexuality, and so on, in order to be recognised as equal. So the content, it seems to me, is suspicious. The lack of content is suspicious. So my question really is how it's possible to articulate a sense of what, as humans, we have in common that is powerful enough, to at least start the process of combating racism, xenophobia, misogyny, ultranationalism, various hatreds of the other. So a conception of what we have in common that's powerful enough for that, but not so loaded with content that our notions of the human become a basis for differentiating between human beings, those who fit and those who don't, nor indeed so lacking in content that it becomes a stripped down, contentless, disembodied abstraction. I've just laid that out in very general terms, and now I'm going to try and fill in what I mean by that, so that I can convince you. Okay, so really what I want, there are lots of issues about the human and humanity in the literature. I'm just going to focus on three that seem to me particularly worth thinking about. The first is the idea of the impotence of the human, the notion that talking about the human or human rights or our common humanity can seem just empty words, kind of meaningless, impotent. In her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, which Hannah Arendt wrote under the shadow of the Nazi concentration camps and the death camps for the Roma, homosexuals and Jews, she wrote of the bitter confirmation, that's her term, the bitter confirmation of all those, like Edmund Burke, who had poured scorn on the French revolutionaries for their crazy ideas about the rights of man. Burke famously argued that you'd be much safer relying on the rights of an Englishman than this kind of abstract, rights of human beings in general. Though she arrives at this from a very different direction, Arendt ultimately agrees. As she puts it, the survivors of the extermination camps, the inmates of concentration camps and internment camps, and even what she describes as the comparatively happy stateless people, could see without Burke's arguments that the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human was their greatest danger. And I think that's an incredibly powerful phrase, that idea of the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human. Basically, in her argument, and it seems to me there's a great deal of power in this, if you've reached the point where you've nothing but your human rights to cling to, right, that's the only basis on which you can call on people to respect you, to recognise you, to treat you with equality. If you've got no state that any longer recognises you as its citizens, if you've got no political authority that is assuming responsibility for your protection or security, you are, she argues, from the evidence of the 20th century, you are pretty much doomed, right? So part of what she's saying there is well, I mean, I think her argument's not just the kind of the more familiar one that I think very often comes up in discussions about human rights, about the ways in which declarations of rights become just empty words unless there are clear mechanisms of enforcement. I mean, this is clearly an important and continuing reservation that people have about the whole politics of human rights, that you can say wonderful things about, the rights that people have as humans, but unless you've got some kind of mechanisms of enforcement, what exactly does it mean? But I think Arendt's argument is not just that. She's saying something deeper than this. She's saying that rights claims are intrinsically bound up with equality, that when we recognise rights, we're recognising our mutual equality. And equality for her, this is the further step for her, equality for Arendt is something that people bring into being within a political context. Equality, and at this point I completely agree with her, equality is not some natural characteristic that we're all born with. I mean, it's a lovely phrase to sort of talk about how all humans are kind of born free and equal. But it's not something that actually is true. Equality is something that we create, it's something that we bring into existence. And in her argument, and here I'm not so sure that I'm convinced by her, but in her argument, it's only within the framework of a political community, or more precisely, when we establish the kinds of political communities that claim to be based on equal rights, that the notion of human rights comes to have any kind of significance. And if that's the case, I mean, if that argument kind of carries any conviction, then the idea of rights, these human rights, providing protection outside the framework of political communities, these rights that we enjoy just as humans rather than of citizens of state X or state Y, that idea becomes implausible. Now, I think nowadays people tend to be less gloomy than Hannah Arendt was about the possibility of transnational bodies that can enforce these human rights, or the power of that language of human rights to mobilise solidarity across national borders. Though I have to say that if you were a refugee in contemporary Britain, living on the kind of less than £5 a day, facing the institutionalised suspicion of the UK border agency, living in fear that you're going to be sent home to the country that's trying to kill you. I mean, if you were in that kind of position, then I think Arendt's kind of point about the abstract nakedness of being nothing but human would ring very true. And even if the human in human rights does have, as I think it does, more transnational force than at the time Arendt was criticising it in the late 1940s, it still falls a long way short of recognising our mutually equal rights. The principle of shared humanity, of us all being human, tends to invite humanitarianism rather than rights. It invokes pity or compassion It invites aid to the suffering or displaced. And if Lily Chiliaraki is right, it doesn't even invite that anymore, but more the kind of the ironic self-gratification in the pleasures of feeling for others. As many critics of the aid relationship or humanitarianism in general suggest, none of this necessarily means recognizing people as having equal status and rights. So in that sense, I think the problem that Arendt identified, how to make a right that is based solely on being human, a meaningful political force, very much continues today. So that's the kind of the first worry about the human, is that kind of the potential kind of impotence of, the nakedness of being nothing but human. The second concern about the notion of the human is the potential for hierarchy and exclusion. Whenever you offer a definition of the human or human species or humanity, you risk endorsing something that then operates as a means of exclusion. And historically, of course, there's a great deal of evidence for this. If, for example, the qualities that make us human are thought to lie in rationality and a capacity for moral judgment, if that's what's supposed to distinguish and differentiate humans from other beings, and women are thought not to exhibit those qualities. And I have to say, even Mary Wollstonecraft thought that women didn't exhibit these qualities, though she did have an analysis of the gendered power relations that brought that about. If you have that kind of substantive definition of the human, and female beings are seen as falling short, then it becomes possible, as for long periods in history happened, it becomes possible to set women outside the category of the human, to say that all men should have equal rights and really mean just men, right? And we know that happened for a very long time. Or, alternatively, if the human is taken as involving a specific way of marking one's separation from nature, which is another kind of very familiar way in which the notion of the human is kind of understood and defined, and some humans seem not to fit this, it becomes possible to set them outside the category. And just to give one historical example, this is from a book by Kay Anderson called Race and the Crisis of Humanism. She argues, as I think many would agree, that the distinctive humanity of the human came to be found in its separateness from nature, and she sort of looks at the ways in which writings, particularly in the 18th century, and the work of the Scottish Enlightenment was quite significant here, developed a kind of an account of human and social development that saw human beings as passing through supposedly universal stages in which we all started out as hunting societies, and then it moved into pasturage, and then cultivation, and finally into commerce. Now, in Anderson's analysis, that humanist understanding of the unity and progression of mankind, of humankind, was thrown into crisis by the bewildering behaviour of Australian Aboriginals, which is the particular case study that she focuses on, who refused to learn settled agriculture and displayed no enthusiasm for separating themselves from nature. And she argues that at this point, this more optimistic humanism that had viewed all peoples as ultimately members of the same human race clearly had stratified them. There was a very strong kind of there was a very strong ranking of peoples in terms of how far along the universal stages of progress different peoples had advanced. So it's not that this more optimistic humanism didn't have a sense of ranking, but it was a kind of more optimistic humanism in the sense that people weren't being ranked by intrinsic difference. There was an assumption that kind of, all humankind was linked in this kind of, all peoples would eventually go through these same stages. In the course of the 19th century, and I think this fits with what a lot of other people have identified in their studies, that kind of more optimistic humanism gives way to the idea of biologically distinct races. It seems to me that that story is one of many stories in which the more precisely the human in humanism or humanity is defined, whether it's by notions of rationality, sociability, settled agriculture, or even vulnerability to pain. I mean, think of the ways in which people used to be able to sort of talk about how particular categories of human beings somehow felt pain less intensely than others. So even vulnerability to pain allows for that kind of ranking and that kind of hierarchy. Now, you might say that those substantive notions of the human, with all of their capacity for this kind of hierarchy of the really human, the not quite human, the subhuman, you might say that, what are sometimes described as philosophical anthropologies are much rarer today, that we've kind of freed ourselves from that kind of, that way of thinking about the human. You might say, well, nobody nowadays locates our claims to human rights, for example, in factual claims about our human nature. And that while, of course, there is plenty of historical evidence, some of which I've just indicated, plenty of historical evidence about the ways in which human has been used in exclusionary fashion, many people would say, well, this is a historical rather than a contemporary problem. I don't myself think that that's the case. Just work on human dignity, for example, very often makes claims about the special worth or the special value of the human species, and often formulates this precisely in those very familiar terms about the capacity of humans to separate themselves from nature. I mean, just to give one recent example, in his book on human dignity, George Kateb argues that, quote, only the human species is a break with nature and significantly not natural. I should add that he doesn't use that in order to say we can mistreat animals, right? I mean, that's not the argument that he's making. But it is a very strong notion of what differentiates the human, what makes us human and makes being human so valuable, is grounded in that quite classic idea about the separation from nature. And I think in popular discourse, depictions of certain peoples as more like animals than humans continue to play a role, for example, in the depiction of the Roma. I'd also add, though I won't explore this here, that I think arguments about what constitutes the human in that kind of rather definitional way have returned with a vengeance in the context of the advances in the biosciences that allow for far-reaching manipulation of human genes and capabilities. And I think in worries about the post-human, the transhuman, the hybrid humans that we're now threatened with or promised through these kinds of developments, substantive ideas of the human, well, what is it that actually makes something human? It seems to me have very much returned to the agenda. So I don't think this second concern about the ways in which ideas about the human have always this potential for hierarchy and exclusion. I don't think that it is just a historical problem. I think it's something that still remains with us today. However, and this is the third worry, I don't think that we can simply escape these differences by just emptying human of all content. I mean, I think that's the attractive solution. I mean, faced with the exclusions that seem to come into play when you have a very, definite understanding of what makes somebody a human being, faced with that, I think it's very tempting to turn to the opposite, so to strip down the notion of the human until it's as abstract as possible, right, independent of all particularities, producing a contentless, all-purpose human. And I think we do this a lot when we talk just very generally about us all being the same under the skin, right? When we brush aside as irrelevant, not to the point, our sex, our sexuality, ethnicity, our political or religious views, when we say it doesn't matter whether we're male or female, black or white, what matters is that we're all human beings. So I think it's very much part of a kind of very much part of the ways in which we try to deal with this kind of, over-specific understanding of the human, is to say, well, all these things are irrelevant, all these particularities and aspects of ourselves. Now, I mean, that might seem like the solution, and I mean, I don't want to totally dismiss it, because I think there's a lot of power in that, being able to kind of appeal to the sense in which behind everything we're all human beings. But it seems to me that that also has a lot of problems. The problem then is not that the human has too much content, that it's too normative, too potentially exclusionary. The problem is that it becomes almost empty. This is something that Kostas Douzinas has argued quite a lot in his work on human rights. He argues that the human, who then becomes the subject of human rights, emerges as an abstraction with as little humanity as possible. Quote, a human cipher, lacking the characteristics that make each person a unique being. And he illustrates with what I think is quite a striking quote from Francis Fukuyama's postmodern future, posthuman future, got it right on the slide, which is written in the context of these worries about the posthuman, the transhuman, the hybrid human. And Fukuyama says, what the demand for equality of recognition implies is that when we strip all of a person's contingent and accidental characteristics away, there remains some essential human quality underneath that is worthy of a certain minimal kind of respect. Call it factor X. Skin colour, looks, social class and wealth, gender, cultural background, and even one's natural talents are all accidents of birth relegated to the class of non-essential characteristics. We make decisions on whom to befriend, whom to marry or do business with, or whom to shun at social events on the basis of these characteristics. But in the political realm, we are required to respect people equally on the basis of their possession of factor X. I think it's quite revealing that, the only word you can come up for it is X, right? Because we've taken all content out of it. What we're left with is simply factor X. That abstraction of this essential human quality from everything that makes us the actual human beings we are is, to use his term, bizarre. Now, I mean, this then sort of brings me back to one of my starting points. I mean, factor X cuts across what has been a central principle in much feminist but also critical race theory, which is that we shouldn't have to abstract from or deny our particularities in order to be recognised as equal. Women should not have to present themselves as disembodied abstractions in order to claim their equal status in the world. Those with darker skins should not have to insist on us all being the same under the skin, should not, that is, have to present themselves as without skin colour in order to be accepted as the equals of those whose skin is lighter. We should not have to pretend away key aspects of ourselves, ask forbearance in the face of our particularities, or appeal to people to see who and what we are beyond our gender, skin colour, sexuality or disability. That idea that we can separate out some core self from all these contingent features, all the contingent features that actually make us who we are, represents those contingencies as of lesser significance, and perhaps even as things to be slightly ashamed of. So, I mean, it's rather odd to quote Hannah Arendt in this context, because her views on political equality, factor X political equality, are actually quite close to Fukuyama's. But there's a rather telling passage in the speech that she gave in 1959 on receiving the Lessing Prize that I think captures some of what I'm trying to get at here. She says, in the case of a friendship between a German and a Jew under the conditions of the Third Reich, it would scarcely have been a sign of humanness for the friends to have said, "Are we not both human beings?" It would have been mere evasion of reality and of the world common to both at that time. They would not have been resisting the world as it was. In keeping with a humanness that has not lost the solid ground of reality, a humanness in the midst of the reality of persecution, they would have had to say to each other, a German and a Jew and friends, right? In other words, the idea that you you just write, you just say what matters is what we all are underneath, is clearly, well, I think, clearly problematic. So that's three problems, right? One is the impotence, the nakedness of the only human. One is the kind of potential, the way in which it's hard to see how it couldn't have some kind of potential for exclusion, the kind of the inability to recognize others that don't quite fit your definition of human as being really fully human. And then this obliteration of difference, where the context is stripped away to produce an abstract personhood that's either genuinely empty, so just denies what we understand by the notion of human, or, and this is what many feminists have argued, gets fleshed out by reference to the characteristics of those more normal and powerful. So all of this is about problems, right? So I kind of started out saying, I really want us to be able to mobilize some notion of common humanity. It seems to me very hard to think about politics in the modern world without being able to mobilize that in some way. And what I've done at this point is basically to rehearse what I think are very real difficulties associated with invoking our common humanity. It's not a simple politics. But for me, the worry very much remains. I think it's hard to dispense with some notion of what we have in common beyond those often exaggerated differences, something that enables us to recognize the human in others. So, as is typical in all lectures and all academic endeavour, one spends a lot more time on saying what's a problem than in offering the solutions. But I do want to say two things as indicating an alternative way forward. I think the first is that we have to really finally abandon the idea of the human as a descriptive term. I think lots of people say that they've done that, but I mean, my sense is that it's not been consistently done. Whatever candidate you choose when you're talking about what is it to be human, whether it's rationality, capacity for moral choice, tool making, the capacity to transcend nature, it's going to lead you into questions about who and what fits. Indeed, of course, that's the point of the description. What's the point of kind of giving a definition of the human if you're not doing that? And then you may be tempted to treat these as matters of empirical investigation. Definitions of the human encourage us into the border disputes about who's in and who's out, and in the process they justify hierarchies. It's not, in my view, helpful to think of humanness as a reality that grounds our rights, as a set of shared characteristics that we find in some beings but not in others, or a list of characteristics that we can use to work out who gets the rights and who doesn't. Recognizing others as human is a political, not a cognitive matter. It's not a matter of, finding out, are they human? Do they have these characteristics? It's a political matter. To put this more directly in the language of equality, which to my mind is what we're really talking about when we're talking about the notion of the human. The commitment to human equality it's not an empirical claim. It's not something that could be overturned by unexpected new evidence about natural inequalities. Nor is it grounded in moral fact, which is a notion that I find very puzzling. It's a claim with a history, in the sense that people only started thinking about human beings as equals in particular periods of history. But I don't see that as making it any the less persuasive or powerful. Saying people are equal, or to put it another way, saying we're all human, is neither a statement about what is, nor, to be honest, is it really a claim about what people hold to be self-evident, because people don't really in practice. It's a political claim. It indicates what I think is still only a very fragile consensus that requires continuous reaffirmation through people's actions and practices. And I just have put a quote here from Jacques Rancière, who argues that terms like man and citizen should be regarded as what he calls surplus names or litigious names that set out a question or a dispute about who is to be included in their count. And he argues that people make these names real, give them meaning, at the point at which they act on them. It's not as though they are, correct or incorrect descriptions of, some beings out there that are human beings. That this is the kind of the notion of man, citizen, equality. These are notions that we make real at the point at which we act on them, which is something I find a more helpful way to think about what is happening when people claim their human rights or talk about their common humanity. The related point is that recognizing others as human, in a way, is not best understood as recognizing them as like us in some fundamental way. In fact, recognize, and I think this is part of what Hannah Arendt was saying, recognize really isn't the right term. I mean, if you talk about recognition, it gives the impression that there's something there, something already existing, which, you identify, you recognize, you find out, you discover. I think we do recognize something in the process in which we come to address more people as human beings. We do recognize something, but not the kind of the real shared humanity under all the differences. I think what we're recognizing are more the power dynamics that have gone into generating all of these presumptions of difference. Or to put it another way, it seems to me that there is a sense in which when we talk about the human, that we are involved in a process of stripping away. But it's not a kind of stripping away of all of the kind of, the irrelevant things that make you who you are, but they're not important. What matters is the human being underneath. It's not a kind of stripping away of those. It's more a matter of stripping away the stereotypes, the preconceptions, the ideological blinkers and hatreds that prevent us from seeing people as people. It's not, I think, a matter of proving an underlying or shared humanity that treats our gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, and culture as irrelevant. It's a commitment to repeat that point. It's a commitment rather than a discovery. It's a politics of equality that involves refusing to attach hierarchical significance to differences. Now, one of my favourite quotes of the moment is from anthropologist Lila Abbulu God, who observes, and this is in direct challenge to those who think of cultures as incommensurate, opaque, profoundly different. She observes that people do not live their lives as, quote, as robots programmed with cultural rules, but as people going through life agonizing over decisions, making mistakes, trying to make themselves look good, enduring tragedies and personal losses, enjoying others, and finding moments of happiness. Now, in one sense, what she's doing there could, of course, be described precisely as revealing, as drawing attention to the underlying human commonality. We're all like this, right? All of us in our lives, we're going through life agonizing over decisions, making mistakes, trying to make ourselves look good, and so on. But, I mean, she's not telling us to, therefore, ignore as irrelevant supposedly surface variations. I mean, this is an anthropologist, right? This is not someone who's going to say, oh, well, all those sort of differences are somehow irrelevant. She's telling us to, or she's kind of calling on us to challenge the politically charged belief that other people, though of course never oneself, live their lives as cultural robots, that we can tell about people that enable us finally to see them. He argued that it's no use whatever to say with Kant, notice that what you have in common, your humanity, is more important than these trivial differences. And he appealed very much to the power of stories in which, in a sense, we make people real by precisely filling in the details about their lives, stories that build on those supposedly trivial elements, and thereby enable us to see the other as a far more effective way to promote a politics of human rights. Now, my point of contact with Rorty is that, like him, I want to move away from those definitional understandings of the essential human to the more everyday levels at which we can see people, however different in other ways, facing similar kinds of challenges and possibilities. I'm not keen, however, on what Rorty also argues about the discourse of human rights involving a gradually expanding circle of acquaintances in which, through these stories and these everyday recognitions, we come to see more and more people as like us. This way of thinking leaves us too much at the centre. We remain the standard against which humanity is recognised and assessed. So there's a kind of, if you're like me, you're recognised as a human. If you're not like me, presumably that means that you are in some way not human, less than human, not yet human. And that kind of reduces the encounter between us and the other to a kind of narcissistic self-affirmation. You know, oh yes, these are people too because I can see they're people like me. So it's not the kind of, you know, though I share with Rorty that kind of idea of the stories about the everyday being the more powerful way in which we think about what we have in common than the kind of, you know, the identification of some kind of, you know, sort of feature of humanity, whether it's our capacity for reason or whatever it might be, that we use to do that. But I don't want to kind of follow him along that line of people like us. It seems to me it's more helpful to think of that kind of recognition of the everyday similarity of people's lives as folding back on the ways we see ourselves, and in the process perhaps jolting some of our own securities. This is a quote from Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's arguing something, I mean, like Abbulu God, he's challenging the notion that peoples from other cultures are somehow profoundly different, and he's describing the mix of the familiar and the unfamiliar that an American visitor to Ghana might experience. And he says, most of the time, once someone has translated the language you don't know, or explained some little unfamiliar symbol or custom, you'll have no more, and of course no less trouble, understanding why they do what they do, than you do making sense of your neighbours back home. He doesn't himself really stress this, but I actually see that, of course, no less, as a particularly important part of that kind of comment, because it seems to me that in recognising what we don't understand about what unfamiliar others do, we may come to realise how much we also don't understand about those closest to us. It's not, that is, just that we come to see others as fundamentally the same of us, in ways that leave our sense of ourselves untouched. It's also that in tracing through those similarities and differences, we may come to view ourselves in a different and perhaps more critical light. At this point, I just want to return to Graham Wallace. Given my current preoccupations, I was somewhat startled to discover that the final chapter of Human Nature and Politics, which I'm quite sure I never got to when I was a student and told to read it, the final chapter is devoted to the topic of nationality and humanity. Now, Wallace, man of his time, makes a number of dubious comments about whether representative government can be made appropriate to all races, and he endorses an international science of eugenics that would encourage the improvement of racial types. But it turns out at the same time that he had little sympathy for the idea that effective notions of citizenship depend on living with people we see as like ourselves. He took issue with those of his contemporaries who were pursuing fantasies of an island race. I mean, a lot of people around this time talking about the kind of the political unification of the, you know, the English, the island race peoples across, you know, England and America, and what Seeley described as the reasonably white inhabitants of our colony's independence. And he's very, very critical of this kind of strand in thinking at that time. And against this, Wallace argues that the evolutionary processes identified by Darwin mean increasing divergence and variability between humans. So in his argument, either we homogenize humanity by exterminating huge sections of it, which he thought some people were quite willing to do, or we recognize that the world is richer for the infinite variations of humanity, get beyond the irrationality of race hatred, and develop a consciousness of a common purpose in mankind. So this isn't really quite what I've argued for tonight, but there are more resonances than I had expected. And then finally, just prompted by the reference to Darwin, and I don't know if you can read it. This is another Jackie Fleming cartoon. So the woman is saying, "I'm surprised woman's biological inferiority doesn't come more naturally to us, Mr. Darwin. It seems to require a great many laws and punishments."
We have about 25 minutes for questions and comments. I suggest we take a few so Anne has a chance to rest her voice. So who would like to go first? I'm conscious of the fact that it's two men who've put their hands up first here. Chandra.
Well, firstly, congratulations.
Yes, it's on.
Yes, congratulations on the lecture. So let me try to contextualize the argument related to this and see what you think about this, because it strikes me that the view that you're presenting may be one that actually makes more sense to us now, in these times, but maybe in a different time it was the case that the kind of argument that you're arguing against might have made more sense. So I'm thinking, for example, of if you go back to the time of the founding of the colonies in the New World, Spanish were debating the humanity of the Indians. It seemed to me it made a lot of sense for those who were defenders of the Indians to say something like, well, they are just like us. And this is the basis for treating them a lot better than they're planning to. This is something that lies at the back of the arguments of Victoria, the arguments of Las Casas. So now we're living in very, very different times. So now maybe we can stop, turn back, reflect, look at things very differently. But maybe it's as much because of the context of our times as because of the actual essential nature of the argument. Maybe you're being even a little bit too essentialistic if you're presenting the argument as a kind of universal argument in itself. Just a thought.
Question down here, all the way at the front. There's a mic coming so the rest of them can hear you.
Sorry. Because you talked about human rights, just to kind of...
No,
I'll hear you.
But it is on, but just...
It is on?
Yeah.
It's really a question of about human rights. Probably more of a comment.
Oh, good. I like those. Yes.
Yes. And it's sort of against Rancière, really, which
Right.
is the politics of does the politics of human rights put the emphasis on human, or does it put it on rights? And it's sort of an anti-intellectual point also in a way, because it seems to me that intellectuals, yes, have been very concerned with the kind of the human bit, but actually something like a human right against torture, for example, all the emphasis is on torture, and it often does have a face of a person. You know, that's how organisations try to mobilise, is to put faces and names and really fill out the kind of context. So, yeah, I'm not, I suppose around human rights, I'm not entirely sure that I agree that we need to focus on the human so much in terms of, that's not so much where the political contestation goes on. It's more about, is that a right and did it happen and that kind of thing. Which,
Take one more.
Yeah, okay.
At the back there. Kai? Right back.
Yeah, thank you very much for the great lecture. So I'd like to explore this, well, it's almost a dilemma that we describe between having not enough content in the human and having too much content. And I was wondering whether there's a middle ground position that you might find plausible or not. So, I mean, it seems clear that in order to be human, we have to have all kinds of other properties. So we have to have skin color, and they have to have sexual identity, and we have to have all kinds of other things. But it also seems true that when it comes to giving reasons about us as humans, when it comes to issues of equality, then the specific instantiations of these properties really should matter. So wouldn't it be plausible to say, yes, I mean, being human means we have all these things, but in certain contexts, in the really relevant, important context, they're really not on the table, or at least the instantiations are not on the table, even though we acknowledge that we have them.
I assume.
Yeah. Is that on? Yeah.
Yeah.
It is. Okay. Thanks very much. Chandra, in relation to your question, I actually have no problem at all about saying that the kinds of arguments that I'm developing are arguments that either arise or become possible in particular periods of history, and I have no problem about recognizing the kind of the power that the notion of creatures like us, they have souls like us, or however the argument goes, the power of that at various significant moments in history. So I don't have any problem with that. It seems to me that one can sort of recognize that, one can recognize the continuing power of that notion, we're all the same under the skin, while still recognizing the problems that are associated with that. And it may be that we're now in a period where it's possible for us to see both of those sides, whereas perhaps in an earlier epoch you either managed to kind of make the claim about the Indians have souls too, or you couldn't see them as like you in any way. So the historicity of the arguments doesn't bother me. I mean, that's entirely compatible with what I'm arguing. In terms of, very interesting what you say, Kate, about the whether people are contesting around the human or contesting around the rights. And I think in terms of, I suppose, a lot of the discussions that go on in the human rights discourse, to the extent that they revolve around which rights should we recognise, of course, the question of the rights is the central focus of attention. But I think that it's very evident that even in a period in which we seem to be very much focused on a language of human rights, that the capacity to grade humans and to kind of to allocate different levels of treatment and recognition according to different kind of categories of humans seems to be able to coexist with a kind of world in which everyone talks the language of human rights. So I don't think, I think it's a kind of, it's something I'll think about more in relation to specifically the human rights politics. But I don't think that you could say that that ambivalence around the human somehow is not on the agenda, or is not something that continues to require contestation. And in terms of your point, Kai, about the I think probably what's at issue there is that I want to challenge the idea that we have to give reasons, in a sense. It seems to me that making the case for recognising others as your equal, to me, is not really about coming up with a convincing argument. It's not really about coming up with an argument which can be grounded in the sort of some kind of claim about something that as humans we have in common. I don't. That's the sense in which I want to say that it's about a commitment rather than about cognition, and it's not about. It seems to me that. When I want to say that I think we should treat people as equal, in a way I'm not open to being argued out of that, really. Whatever reasons you give, I'm sorry, I'm just not open to being argued about it. I realise that in any kind of political discourse, one does have to give reasons. That's part of what one does in politics. So I'm not saying that one never engages in the process of coming up with reasons that might seem convincing to one particular person that you're in dialogue or another. And there'll probably be different kinds of reasons that you'll give depending on who you're arguing with. But at a really profound level, I don't think that the issue about who you recognise as a human or whether you recognise humans as equals actually depends on the reasons that you give. So I think there's probably quite a I think that's probably the point at which that I'm sort of taking issue with what you're saying.
Okay, so Christian was first here in the middle.
Yeah, so my question is actually a follow-up to the discussion that you just had with Kai. So would it be fair to say that you take that to be two different or fundamentally different strategies for thinking about our common humanities? The first strategy, which you're criticizing, would be to look for some descriptive characteristic or attribute that we all have in common, and then somehow to show that this attribute, maybe in the presence of some more fundamental moral principle, grounds our equality. And you're pointing out that whichever attribute we choose, rationality, consciousness, the ability to experience pain and so on, we might run into the problem of ranking people on the basis of that attribute and maybe excluding some who should not be excluded and so on and so on. The alternative strategy then would be to say we're not looking for a descriptive equality grounding attribute, but we rather make it a fundamental normative premise or commitment that we are all equal. And that, I take it, is the strategy that you're proposing. So I suppose then the only question is, this is fine for those who are already committed to the humanist cause and who were converted already, but what can we say to defend that commitment to those who are not yet converted? And unfortunately, of course, that's still a challenge that we face in today's world.
Two more.
My question is more as an historian.
It's on.
It's on.
It's on.
Are the problems you've indicated peculiar to the concept of humanity? In other words, are the same problems peculiar or shared with other concepts, be they race, in fact some of the ones you actually want to object to, be they race, gender, humanity, class? I find it interesting, it seems to me these all get formulated as a particular kind of concept at the same time, and I do think that modernity is important. I don't think the way pre-modern people thought about these broad categories is necessarily the same. And it seems to me that they are basically categories in which everybody is in or out by virtue of some quality they don't choose, and in which they're equal if they're in and unequal if they're out. And why is this peculiar to humanity? And isn't the problem that in all cases the decision, a political decision, to choose to treat people like this is naturalised into a decision that they are intrinsically like this? So I wonder in the end whether one shouldn't call your lecture the human in politics as the human, the class, the gender, the race, the nation, and any other general category I can think of in politics.
One more.
So I want to follow up what Kai and Christian said and just push it just a little bit further. When you make that move from kind of a descriptive humanity to a more ascriptive approach, and you say, look, I'm not willing to negotiate over this is just part of my commitment, run to the problem that Christian described, how do you argue with people who don't share that commitment? And I was wondering if you're not then closer to Rorty than you wanted to be, because you're then in the position, maybe you're then committed to use these arguments, or to use arguments that work. So because you're not defending humanity in relation to any more fundamental value, you're just committed to it. So when you want to defend it, you just in a way, you have to use these arguments that just work in convincing other people. Maybe those arguments are the kind of thick arguments of everyday elements of human life that we happen to share, that carry the danger of kind of creating a hierarchy again. And I was just kind of trying to be a bit positive as well. I was wondering if maybe a kind of family resemblance conception of humanity may give you a way out, because it gives you a bit of elasticity and kind of blurs any type of ranking that you might get out of, say, everyday life conceptions.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll take the first and the third together, because obviously they're linked. So in fact, part of what I was going to say in response to the challenge about how do you convince somebody who doesn't share a particular commitment to, all humans are equal. I was in fact going to sort of appeal partially precisely to Rorty's particular approach, in the sense that I agree with him that the kinds of stories that we tell which make people real to us, I don't like his kind of long, sad, sentimental tales kind of way of capturing that, but I do think that those stories that we tell that make people real are a kind of crucial part of the way in which that argumentative process develops. So I incline to his position on that, in terms of, do you make an argument which is somehow where you bludgeon people over the head with the logic of your argument, or do you tell them some long, sad, sentimental tale? I'm more on the side of the long, sad, sentimental tale. But where I want to differ, and the everyday life component of that, I think is extremely important. And that's one of the things I like about the quote from Abbulu God, which is sort of just getting us to think about the ways in which people, wherever they are, in whatever kind of circumstances and whatever kind of conventions they live their lives through, actually we all face very similar kinds of challenges and difficulties. It's a kind of a less normative notion of the human condition than the way in which, say, Hannah Arendt uses it. But where I want to differ from Rorty is the like us aspect of it, right? So that I do think that it's bringing people to life through the kind of the everyday that we draw attention to. But I think that the process there, when it's kind of conceived as, and don't you see how exactly like you these people are underneath it all, or behind it all, or in some way, if you stop thinking about the fact that they speak a different language or they wear different kinds of clothes, I think the like us is far too unquestioning of the kind of that it's a one-way process. It's regarded too much as a one-way process. So I don't think it's a kind of hierarchy. It's not the kind of the hierarchy that you're in or you're out, but it's imposing a particular way of viewing everyone. So my answer to Christian is partly Rorty, but then my answer to you is Rorty minus some of the things that he wants to attach to that. On the question about all of these general categories actually sort of coming into our way of thinking and our language at roughly the same time, I think that is actually very much to the point. And I think so. I suppose, and I suppose where I'm starting from is, you spend years of your life at LSE Gender Institute, you become extremely sensitized to the critiques of the notion of gender, right, and the ways in which gender has you need to be able to think about gender in a way that kind of frees you from some of those kind of essentialized ways of understanding it. And in a sense, I suppose I'm applying some of the same kinds of techniques to thinking about humanity. So I accept very much the point about the similarities, but where I can see what you're raising as a potential problem for me is that if I'm looking to some way of thinking about humanity that is a counter or is in some way in tension with the the class, race, gender categories, then that seems to be thrown to some extent into into question if we think that all of these are about a kind of naturalization of certain kinds of categories. But I think the general point that you're making about it's significant that all of these ideas come to be deployed and mobilized round about the same time is actually a very, very significant feature of them. But then that's partly why we can't simply kind of appeal to the humanity as a way of solving the problems that arise in relation to the other ones.
Can you move one around?
Yeah.
Good.
And then there's a bit.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Anne. Is that on here? I'm pretty curious what you think about that other kind of post-humanism, the vitalist work that tries to move beyond thinking about what constitutes the human, instead blurs the boundaries between the human and the non-human, not through marking categories between humans, but through thinking about human, animal, a kind of vitalism that might also be found in the earth or in other kinds of forms and so on. And the reason I ask is, I'm not sure what I think about it really, but the reason I ask is because it opens up a slightly different set of questions around an ethics of relationality rather than a question of the differences between entities, and more a focus on what might historically within feminist theory have been called an ethic of care, which is less dependent on identifying or recognising particular entities and more focused on the question of the ethics of what the relationship between them is, irrespective of how one characterises them.
And then next to you, I think probably given the fact the mic's already there.
Thanks again, I really enjoyed that. I'm just interested in why you want to interrogate the human particularly, because you use the phrase quite a lot about human commonality, and Arendt is obviously, has some importance in the way you're articulating. And when you were talking about the royalty line just now, I was thinking, why isn't the commonality, as in what common means, which isn't necessarily sameness internally between them, it's actually sharing a space in some sense, or back to ideas about relationality as Claire just mentioned. So I wondered if there's something about world disclosure, world bearing, something like that comes out of that Arendtian frame that gives you the resonances and the connections without the need for identifications or essence or a list of things, and that still will provide ways of persuading and explaining where it is that you think this commitment to equality comes from.
And then there's a third question over here.
Thank you. I very much like this idea that equality is a political status. That's very close. I was a bit worried by the answer that you gave to Kai. I can see why you want to avoid giving reasons and not having to explain and justify what's different about me, even though it's still important. But I'm just a little worried that if we're not talking about differences, are we able to take account of them properly and improve them? And then I thought, well, maybe that's not the drive at all. So I wanted to know, what is equality for?
Okay. Human-animal blurring boundaries. I actually, I haven't got a worked-out position on this. I don't actually find it very engaging somehow, which is not to say, it's obviously it's a sort of separate matter from the question of how one thinks about human rights in relation to animal rights. That's a kind of separate issue. But about the kind of the whether one wants whether one wants to get out of the problems that I'm identifying in terms of the way that definitions get us into boundary disputes between who's in and who's out, and can we just get out of that by, in a sense, abandoning the notion of the boundary and thinking about the relationship. I sort of think as though that's a little bit too much trying to solve it by playing around with words. So that the kind of, I don't really see the connection that you're trying to make between the ethic of care and the kind of the relationality that goes into that, and then the kind of the question of the sort of the emphasis on the kind of the leaky boundaries, the blurring of boundaries, the kind of the hybridity. It just doesn't carry weight to me. Sorry, that's a terrible answer. I apologise. Right, and I'm going to give a terrible answer to you as well, Kim. Because part of the answer, the honest answer is, I don't want to be simply repeating everything that Hannah Arendt said, right? So I can't just say, well, she identifies the problem and she solves it, which anyway I don't think. I think in thinking about this kind of project, I mean, I started with the kind of the idea of humanism, in fact. I mean, initially I was thinking about the ways in which there's been so much critique of humanism, the idea of humanism, and ways in which I find that problematic. And then I moved a bit away from that because it's very hard nowadays to talk about humanism without getting drawn into a different kind of discourse, which is around secularism and religion, and those aren't the issues that I was particularly focused on. And so then I moved to the human, and I was partly aided by Graham Wallace in this, and thinking, well, what would be a nice title for this lecture? You know, the human in politics, kind of reflecting human nature in politics. And in fact, in working on it, it's common humanity that is has become more the focus of my questions and concerns. So part of what you're pointing to is in fact a kind of shift that's going on as I try to identify what exactly is it that is troubling me about the kind of humanitarian, human rights, humanity. There's a kind of, there's a sort of a range of issues there. And I think you're right that the human doesn't quite capture everything that I'm trying to get at. Another very bad answer. And then on the kind of the question about what is equality for? Well, can I first say, just in clarification, if I sounded as though I'm saying that I think we can go through life without giving reasons for anything, that isn't actually my position. I think we do have to give reasons, and of course we engage in argument with people, and of course in engaging in argument with people, we draw on a whole range of resources in order to try and convince people who currently disagree with us that they should shift their positions. So it's not that I'm saying that I want to kind of that I think that we can go through life with very strong commitments to something, but never feel that we have to give reasons for it. It's more that I don't think that the commitment, in a sense, stands or falls by the kinds of reasons that you try to mobilise in the argument. And in terms of, I suppose I wouldn't want to think of equality as something that is for anything, really. I mean, I suppose that makes it seem as though it's kind of, well, it makes it seem as though it's a means to something else. I mean, that's the kind of structure of that question, that equality is for doing something that may be more important or more significant. And I don't think I would want to think about equality in that way, but we should maybe talk more about that.
Well, it remains for me to say thank you all for coming, and to thank you very much for hosting this.